Hey guys, this is another video in my Python series, and today we're going to be learning about for loops. They're quite similar to while loops, which I went over in our fifth video, and they're both used for different purposes, but loops are really important in Python, and today we're going to be going over for loops, the range function, and we're going to be going over basic revision of loops as we go on through this video. So, for loops are basically loops that iterate over a sequence and perform actions here. And what this means is, so let's go over iterate. What does iterate mean? Iterate means like cycling through something, going through each and every element of that sequence. And what's a sequence? A sequence is like a list, basically. So far, there are more sequences than like a list, but so far we only know about lists and strings. A string is also a sequence. We can go through a string. So iterating over a sequence is going through every single element of that. It's every single item of that sequence, basically, like a list or string. And they perform actions. So basically, an iterate. So we're going to be learning about iterators and iterables and many things that are important in learning about for loops. So here is an example. So we have ls is a list which contains the numbers from 1 to 5, and for I in ls print I. What this means is let's look at the syntax of a for loop. I is an iterator. Now what's an iterator? An iterator is it's not a variable. It's an object that goes over a list, and it represents each element of that list. So this iterator would go over an iterable. And an iterable is it's synonymous to like a sequence. An iterable is anything that you can iterate over, anything that you can go over. Okay? So that's what an iterable is. So for iterator, an iterable perform an action. Sorry, there needs to be a indent there. Very important. So an iterator again is an object that goes over an iterable, and it goes over every element of that iterable, every item, and it represents itself like that. So it may sound confusing, but don't worry, you'll get used to it. So let's go over to our newly created file and paste this in. So there you go. We now officially have a list. Okay, that is the numbers 1 through 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And let's just copy this in. So now let's talk about what this is and how it works. Indenting. Okay, for I in ls, print I. It looks simple, but it has a lot of theory behind it. So for I in ls, it's basically just I is it's an iterator, right? So it's an object. So the list ls has 5 elements, and I is gonna go over each element, and I is gonna sort of become that item. So in the first iteration, or in the first cycle, first loop, whatever you want to call it, in the first iteration, I is gonna be 1. So when we're cycling through ls, when we're iterating through ls, we're going to go through the first element, second element, third element, so on. And so for right now, in the first iteration, I is going to be 1. So for I in ls, right now I is 1, so we're going to print I. So we print I, which is 1. So we print 1, right? Then when I becomes 2, we're going to print 2. Then when I becomes 3, 4, and 5. Basically, so now we're going to print 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's how for loops basically work. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. There you go. We have that. Okay, and so that's basically an overview of how you might want to work with these. And now that I hope you can understand what this means, right? Like in iterator. So this is the syntax for iterator, and our iterator here is I in iterable. Our iterable here is ls. It's a sequence. Do some action, and the action we're doing is just very simple, just printing I. So we're going to be printing I, and no if conditions, no nothing. We're just going to be printing it right now. And as you may have learned whenever you learned about while loops, that we can use the break and continue statements, and we can implement that same technique here. If you don't know what break and continue statements are, a brief overview of them would be that a break statement breaks the loop. So it breaks the whole loop, all iterations. Okay, it just stops the whole loop from going. And the continue statement only breaks the current iteration. It terminates the current iteration and moves on to the next one. So it just prematurely ends the current iteration. So let's try to implement that same technique here. So if I is 5, right? Again, 2 equal signs indicating that this is called a comparison operator. It compares two numbers. If I is 5, so if the value of I is 5, and then if it is, then we're just gonna break the loop before it even gets to print I. So let's print that. We only get 1, 2, 3, and 4. Why is that? Why don't we get 5? Because when I becomes 5, in the 5th and last iteration for I in ls, when I becomes 5, we made this condition here. If I is 5, then we're going to break. And I is 5, so it's going to break the whole loop before you can even reach this line of code, which says to print, which tells Python to print I. So that way, poor 5 never got printed. So because we broke the loop right before it. So now let me change it up a bit. Maybe make this 3. Make this continue. And for I and ls, if I is 3, then we're going to continue. So we're going to terminate whatever's below, which is basically just print I. And we're going to move on to the next iteration, where I now becomes 4, right? So let's print this. As you can see, we've gotten 1, 2, 4, and 5. So 4. So we didn't really get to print 3 because before we could, we just continued the loop. It sounds weird, but we put the continue statement there, so it terminated the current iteration, and it moved on to the next iteration before Python even got a chance to print I. Yeah. So that's how you can implement those into for loops. Okay, those two statements. So not only can they be used for while loops, but also for for loops. Okay, so we have that piece of code. Now let's move on to the range function. I've been really looking forward to this. I've been really fascinated by it, really. Let's look at it. So let me copy this piece of code. Comment this. All this. Guys, you're going to the bottom. Sorry, but whoa. Completely wrong place. There. Everybody is going to the bottom. There. So we can make space for the new king, the for loop with the range function. Now this maybe completely new to you, which is completely fine because I am gonna show you how this works. Right before I correct this indent, it always it always indents it for some reason. Okay, so for j in range 111, so we're choosing another iterator here. So you can name it anything you want, just like you can name variables anything you want. So for j, so we can name this like num. Put num here because num stands for number, by the way, and because we can put anything here, not just I or j. I or j, like variables are usually just x and y and z, x, y, and z, and when we're using for loops, people like to use I, j, and k. So yeah, but we're gonna be using num. Again, we can name it whatever we want. For num in range 1 and 11, print num. What this does is, so the range function sort of creates a sequence. It fabricates a new sequence for us. So from 1 to 11, right? And the special thing about this, well, not really special, the unique thing about this is that 11 doesn't actually get counted. So it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And 10 again, 10 too, but not 11 because it's not inclusive. 11 just doesn't get included. I feel really bad for him. So for num in range 111, print num, that'll just print the numbers from 1 to 10, including both 1 and 10. Not 11. Okay. So that's what. Like a few moments ago, we were discussing how, well, I was telling you about basically how for loops iterate over a sequence, right? And what we did was we created a list from the numbers 1 through 5. And then we went through that list. What the range function does, it just takes care of that for us. So it just creates a whole sequence on the spot for num in range 111. So this term here, range 111, is basically when Python sees it, then Python's like, oh, we've got to create a sequence from 1 to 10 that this for loop is gonna iterate over. Now this iterator num is gonna go over, right? So that's what it does. So from 1 to 11. Now let's look a bit more into the sequence. Let's look a bit more into the syntax of the range function. So it actually has 3 parameters. And what a parameter means, it's like a value that is given in a function, like the range function, right? We only give them 2 parameters, 1 and 11, but we can give them 3 parameters. That's the maximum. And the minimum is actually 1. You need to have 1 parameter. And we're going to be talking about that. So what start means is it's a starting value. In our case, it's 1. And then the stop is the stop value, the place where we stop, which is 11. And by the way, the stop value does not get counted in the sequence, like I told you. So that's why 11 didn't get counted. It was just 1 through 10. And then there's step, which not many people use, but it can be useful sometimes. So what step is basically just, I'll explain this, the distance between 2 elements that we're iterating over. So oh gosh, I'm horrible at this. Basically, so for when we have like for j in range 111, where the start value is 1 and the stop value is 11, but we don't have a step value because the step value by default is 1. So when we go through 1 through 10, right? 1 through 11, not counting 11, same thing, right? We're just, our step is 1, so we're going over every item. So every single item, like 1, 2, 3, 4, every single one. But if we make the step 2, it's going to go over every other item. So actually it's going to go over 1, then it's going to skip 2, and it's going to go over 3. Then it's going to skip 4 and go over 5. That way it'll print 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, so on and so forth, right? But so that's what it's going to do. And if we make the step 3, then what that means is in the first 3 numbers, it's only going to print in the first 3 items in the first 3 items in the iterable, it's just going to print the first one. So out of 1, 2, and 3, it's going to print 1. Out of 4, 5, and 6, it's going to print 4. Out of 7, 8, and 9, it's going to print 7. That way it's going to be 1, 4, and 7. Or like that. So that's what step is, basically. And start and step, these parameters, they're optional. Like, for example, we didn't include step here because we didn't have to. The only mandatory parameter is stop. We have to just define where it's going to stop. But it may be confusing. Why don't we have to specify what's the start parameter is? Because start by default isn't 1, it's 0. Because when we went to preschool, we learned numbers like this: 1, 2, 3. When Python went to preschool, it studied numbers like this: 0, 1, and 2. Its first number that it learned was 0. It can be confusing, but that's just how it is. And so basically for the start value in here, it's going to be by default 0. We can specify it, but if we don't specify it, then Python will just consider it 0. So let's try to do that here. Let's just make this some random number like 5. For our num in range 5, print num. Hold on, okay. For num in range 5, print num. And since the start value we didn't specify, it's going to be 0. So it's going to be 0, starts with 0. So it's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so it's going to be 4. But the reason it won't include 5 itself because the stop value never gets included. So for num in range 5, print num, and 5 doesn't get included. And since we didn't specify the start value, it just became 0. So it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's print that just to verify. As you can see here, it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let's go back to our old one. 1, 11, and 1. Basically, the third value here is a step value, and we don't need to specify it because it's just default 1. Its default value is 1. But before I end this video, let's just have some fun with the step parameter, because it can be pretty interesting sometimes. So let's make it 2, for example. Now let's see what happens. So it gives us 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. Only odd numbers because it's skipping through each even number, right? The step is 2. So it basically the distance it's stepping over, the distance that it's cycling over each over the items, the distance that it's iterating over the items in the sequence is 2. So it's gonna go 1, 3, 5. So its step has increased. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's gonna be 1, 3, 5. It's now 2, not 1. Now let's make it 3. Alright. That gives us 1, 4, 7, and 10. And since our numbers are they're right next to each other, they're consecutive numbers, right? Since they're consecutive, consecutive just means one number after another number, like immediately after. So it's 1, 4, 7, and 10, and that's because, and the difference between each number is 7. I'm sorry, the difference between each number is 3, because the step is 3. This won't always happen, but because our numbers are consecutive, it will, because they're right next to each other. Basically, now we have the step is 3, so it's gonna be like 1, and then it skips 2 and 3. 4, it skips 5 and 6. 7, it skips 8 and 9. 10. So that's how it came up with 1, 4, 7, and 10. Let's go even crazier and make this 4. Here we have 1, 5, and 9. Because out of the first 4 numbers, 1, 2, 3, and 4, we're choosing the first one. Out of the next 4 numbers, 5, 6, 7, and 8, we're choosing the first one, 5. Out of the next 4 numbers, 9, 10, 11, and, well, I mean, actually, we're not even going past 10. So just 9 and 10, it chooses 9. So out of the first 4 numbers, out of each set of 4 numbers, it just chooses the first one. So 1, 5, 9. And yeah, that's, so if we make this, because this is pretty short, just 1 through 10, but if we make this like let's say, I think 100 will be too much, but sure, let's go through from 1 to 100. And the reason I made 101 is because that's, if I made it 100, which is a pretty common mistake, it's not going to include 100. It's just going to stop at 99. So we need to make this 101, so it includes 102. Now let's see what we get up with. Oh gosh, that list. Man. Okay, so 1, 5, 9, 13, 17. So as you can see, it just goes over the first 4 numbers and chooses the first one. So that was it. That was all that I wanted to show you in this video. And other than that, I think there's nothing that we need to know. We went over for loops. We went over the range function. And we had a revision of loops. So, like, you know how loops work. And yeah. So, thank you for watching. If you want more videos, please subscribe and do me a favor by hitting that like button. Alright, thank you so much for watching. See you in my next video.